The King of France was afraid that he would crack if touched, and France cracked along with him. Why? Imagine a room covered with pillows. Mirrors multiply the image of a lonely man sitting motionless and whispering, "Don't touch me. I'll break." He was not just a madman. He was the King of France, the ruler of the largest state in 14th century Europe, a man who was supposed to lead armies, receive ambassadors, and decide the fate of millions. Now imagine that this king trembles with fear of being touched because he believes his body is made of glass. Such a figure in history was Charles VI of France, who was called the Glass King. His illness went down in the annals of history not only as a strange case of psychiatry, but as a symbol of the catastrophe that destroyed an entire state. France, which until recently had been a superpower, turned into an arena of internal strife, conspiracy, and betrayal under his reign. But what was it really? Chroniclers loved to exaggerate. Historians argue, did Charles really suffer from glass delusion syndrome? Or is it just a metaphor? Or perhaps the rumors were a convenient tool for those who wanted to discredit the monarch and rule in his place. The facts, however, speak for themselves. There is evidence that servants surrounded him with pillows because he ordered them not to touch him, saying, "Don't touch me, I'll break." He wore clothes with metal inserts to strengthen his body. He sat motionless for hours, afraid to take a step. To his subjects, this seemed not just strange, it was frightening. Because the king, who was supposed to embody the power of the state, was himself afraid of his own fragility. Now here's a question for you. Can a country survive if its ruler is afraid of his own body? But here's what's even more terrifying. The glass mania was just one of the symptoms. Before that, there were bouts of uncontrollable rage, cases of amnesia when he didn't even recognize his wife and children. And most importantly, all these breakdowns occurred at the most critical moment in French history, when the country was at war with England in the 100 Years' War. And here the main question arises. Are we talking about the tragic personal illness of one king, or the illness of the entire system? Because with Charles VI, it was not only his personality that fell apart, the whole state was falling apart with him. In the next 15 minutes, you will hear how one breakdown of reality split the country: a fire during a banquet, a murder in the middle of Paris, a crown without an heir, and a peasant girl who challenged the empire. But that's just the beginning. After all, glass mania is just the tip of the iceberg. To understand how France ended up in the hands of a man who was afraid of his own shadow, we need to go back to the very beginning. Imagine the scene. The throne of the largest European state passes to an 11-year-old boy. And that's when the real tragedy begins. In 1380, France lost King Charles V. He was a ruler whom his contemporaries called the Wise. He restored order in the state, strengthened power, and returned the lands lost during the 100 Years' War. His death was a blow, but an even greater blow was who was to replace him. Charles VI ascended the throne. He was only 11 years old. A boy, a child among wolves. The French were waiting for a new Augustus, a monarch who would continue his father's work. But the country got a young king, behind whom immediately grew up uncles, real predators in power. The Dukes of Anjou, Bourbon, and Burgundy. Instead of ruling wisely, they rushed to the treasury as if it were their own feeding trough. The treasury, filled by Charles V, began to melt away. Taxes rose, money disappeared into banquets, private armies, and endless intrigues. Paris grumbled, the peasants groaned, and the nobility rubbed their hands together. And what did the king do? He just sat on the throne, a symbol of power that did not belong to him. His name was on documents he did not even read. Decisions were made for him, and he was more of a hostage than a ruler. Think about it. You are 11 years old. You are the king of the largest state in Europe, but all the power is in the hands of your uncles, who see you only as a figurehead. How long could this last? But the years pass, and the child becomes a young man. And then something unexpected happens. Charles, who seemed to be a shadow of his court, begins to take power into his own hands. He expels the most greedy uncles, brings finances back under control, and introduces a new order in the royal administration. His steps are perceived as dawn after a long night. The French begin to believe again. Here he is, the very new Augustus promised by his late father, a young monarch capable of changing the country. Charles is even called the Beloved. He is compared to his father, and sometimes even to St. Louis himself. Paris applauds. Chroniclers write enthusiastic lines, and it seems that the dark years of the Regency are behind them. But cracks are already appearing behind the facade of the energetic, wise young man. Outbursts of anger, unexpected periods of seclusion, suspicious silence. Small symptoms that are not yet frightening, but already alarming. And then comes the day that divides Charles's life into before and after. Summer 1392. The king sets off on a campaign to Brittany. Sun, knights, the glint of weapons. And suddenly, the sound of metal. And in an instant, Charles's mind breaks. Then everything goes haywire. Are you ready to hear how France lost its king in the forest while he was still alive? In the early 1390s, France lived with a sense of relief. Finally, the chaos of the Regency was over, and so was the shameless plundering. The young Charles VI took it upon himself to rule and immediately surprised his subjects. He removed the most insolent uncles from power, brought finances back under the control of the crown, and supported fairer taxes. His entourage consisted not of greedy relatives, but of talented advisors. The courts worked faster, the treasury was replenished, and the army received funds. And most importantly, Charles showed the human face of the monarchy. He communicated with the townspeople, listened to their complaints, and sometimes even acted as a mediator in conflicts. He was called our beloved king. Chroniclers wrote that the people bless his name. The young monarch seems like a new beginning. People compare him to Charles V, and some even elevate him to the level of the legendary St. Louis. In the eyes of the French, he is a savior, a hope, a symbol of strength and order. At the same time, however, courtiers are beginning to notice something strange. The king, who seems cheerful and fair, sometimes explodes with rage for no reason. He can remain silent for hours, isolating himself from everyone. He laughs, then falls into a pensive apathy. It looks like nervous exhaustion on the part of the young monarch, but no one yet suspects that these symptoms are warning signs of a great tragedy. Now imagine, you are traveling with the king, and suddenly he draws his sword and shouts, "Traitors," at you. What would you do? The king set off for Brittany amid scandal after Pierre de Crayon's assassination attempt on Constable Olivier de Clisson. In the heat, on a forest road near Le Mans, the sudden clang of weapons became the spark, and something snapped in Charles. He draws his sword and, shouting "Traitors," rushes at his own men. The frenzied attack lasts for hours. He chops, strikes, and pursues his knights, hearing neither pleas nor cries. His brother, the Duke of Orleans, barely escapes with his life. When Charles is finally stopped, he falls to the ground in exhaustion. When he wakes up, he remembers nothing. Complete amnesia. For France, this was a signal. The king no longer belonged to himself. His mind had cracked, and this crack would become an abyss that would drag the entire state down with it. But this was only the first blow. The worst was yet to come. Because in a year's time, France would witness an event that would go down in history as a symbol of the curse that haunted this dynasty. And it would all begin with a wedding that was supposed to be a joyful occasion. 1393, Paris. The royal court is preparing for a wedding. Not just any wedding, but a so-called good wedding. A celebration of a court lady who is marrying for the second time. The atmosphere was supposed to be light and playful. The nobles wanted to entertain the king and themselves with something unusual, and they came up with a dangerous game, a savage masquerade. 6 noblemen, including Charles VI himself, dressed up in costumes made of tow covered with tar. They looked like primitive creatures, hairy, covered in sticky dark mass. One of the courtiers jokingly said, "Here are our crazy forest spirits." The idea was simple. Burst into the hall, howl, jump around, and scare the guests. A fun scene, a carnival joke. But instead of laughter, it turned into a tragedy that will be remembered for centuries. In the midst of the revelry, one of the servants brought a torch too close to the savages. A spark. Fire. In an instant, the costumes burst into flames like torches. Screams tore through the hall. Panic. Flames engulfed people, and they rushed in different directions, like living torches. For nobles died before the eyes of the queen, ladies, and guests. The air was thick with smoke, screams drowned out the music, and the banquet instantly turned into a nightmare. Charles survived only by a miracle. He was saved by his aunt, the Duchess of Berry. Risking her life, she rushed to him, wrapped him in her skirt, and extinguished the flames. The king survived, but was so shocked that he could not speak for several days. Among those who died were noblemen, Yvette de Foix and Hugo de Guise. Chroniclers wrote that the guests froze in horror. Some turned away, others fell to their knees, praying that the flames would not spread to the entire hall. In the recollections of eyewitnesses, the phrase, "It seemed as if hell itself had opened up in the middle of the banquet," was often heard. Now tell me, would you trust such a court to rule a country fighting for its life in the 100 Years' War? The people called this event the Burning Ball. It became a symbol of something more terrible than a mere accident. People whispered that a curse hung over France. The king was mad, the court was in flames, and the future was dark. For contemporaries, this fire was a sign of God's wrath. After all, a monarch who already had a reputation for being not quite sane could burn to death with his friends in the middle of a banquet. To the common people, it looked like proof of decline. The court was playing with fire while the country was bleeding in the 100 Years' War. And Charles himself, after this tragedy, plunged even deeper into madness. His attacks became more frequent, his behavior more bizarre. And soon he would make a statement that would surprise even the most hardened courtiers. Charles suddenly decided that he was made of glass. After the fire at the Ball of Fire, something finally broke in Charles VI. Whereas his attacks had previously looked like episodes of anger or memory lapses, now his behavior showed signs of true obsession. The king began to believe that his body was made of glass. Not figuratively, literally. He was afraid that any touch would shatter him into pieces. Strange scenes appeared in the halls of the Louvre and the palaces of Paris. Servants covered chairs with pillows before the king sat down, because if the surface beneath him was too hard, he would break. He ordered blankets to be placed even on marble floors so that he would not fall and crack. His clothing also changed. Metal inserts were sewn into his suits to strengthen his body. The courtiers followed him carefully, keeping their arms spread wide, as if around explosives. One careless touch, and the king would scream in horror. Now here's a question for you. Can the people trust the state if its ruler is convinced that he is made of glass? Chronicles wrote, Charles sat motionless in his chair for hours, afraid to move. Sometimes he whispered, "Don't touch me, I'm fragile." From the outside, it looked more than just strange. It was humiliating for the monarchy. The king was supposed to be a symbol of strength, the embodiment of the stability of the state. But here was a ruler who was afraid of his own shadow, hiding under pillows and living in fear of breaking. But this glass syndrome was only part of a deeper breakdown. Soon, Charles began to lose his memory. He forgot who he was. He forgot that he was king. Interestingly, Charles was not alone. In the late Middle Ages, this strange fear, glass mania, affected other European nobles as well. Some nobles, and even scientists, sincerely believed that their bodies were made of glass and could shatter at the slightest touch. It was a kind of cultural epidemic, a delusion that reflected the fragility of human life and the fear of the unknown. And if before his subjects looked at him with concern, now they looked at him with horror. After all, France was effectively left without a ruler. And this was only the beginning of the next act of the tragedy, because very soon Charles would begin to not recognize those closest to him, even his own wife. The glass fear was only half of the tragedy. The other half turned out to be even more frightening. Charles began to lose his own identity. One morning, he woke up, saw his wife, Isabella of Bavaria, and asked, "Who is this woman? Why is she here?" The queen, the mother of his children, was completely forgotten. His children also became strangers. He would turn away from them, shouting, "They are not mine. They were planted here." And in moments of delirium, Charles insisted that he was a simple peasant who had nothing to do with the throne. What did the courtiers do? They began to put on a show. The ladies and advisors pretended that everything was normal. Some prompted him with words. Others slipped him documents with large letters for him to sign, without even understanding their meaning. They maintained the illusion that France still had a king. Now imagine, you are an ambassador to France. You enter the hall, and the king looks at you and sees an enemy. Would you trust such a state? But the illusions shattered like the fragile glass that Charles believed in. Fear reigned at court. Would he lash out again in a fit of rage? Would he forget that he was dealing with an ambassador, not an enemy, who must be destroyed? While the king lived in a delusion, the streets of Paris were flooded with real blood. And while theater was being played in the halls of the palace, a real tragedy was unfolding outside its walls. For in 1407, France heard a blow from which it could no longer recover. On November 14, 1407, Paris witnessed a crime that tore France in two. Louis of Orleans, brother of Charles VI, left the Louvre in the evening. His escort was small, as it was a routine trip, a visit to Queen Isabeau. The streets were lit by torches, and the cobblestones glistened with rain. And it was there, in a dark alley next to the Church of Saint Innocent, that an ambush awaited him. When the carriage stopped, masked horsemen rushed in with shouts. Louis was pulled from his horse and mortally wounded. In a few minutes, he was lying on the ground, and panic swept through the street. Who was behind this murder? There was no mystery. The very next day, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, proudly declared, "Yes, I ordered his murder," because he was a debaucher and a traitor. Imagine, the murderer of the king's brother comes out in public, openly admits to the crime, and gets away with it. How would you react? No punishment, no exile. Jean calmly walked the streets of Paris like a hero. This shocked the French. If even the king's brother could be hacked to death in the capital, and the murderer openly boasted about it, then whose life had any value at all? This event became a point of no return. Paris split into two camps, supporters of the Orleans, the Armagnacs, and supporters of the Burgundians. War broke out not with the English, but between the French themselves. The capital, which until recently had been the heart of European culture, was now turning into an arena of civil war. After the murder of Louis of Orleans, Paris was split in two. There was no longer a united France on the streets. There were only two camps thirsting for blood. The Armagnacs, who supported the heirs of Orleans, and the Burgundians, the people of Jean Sans-Père. The capital became the arena for this deadly confrontation. At night, the streets became traps. Armed gangs roamed the neighborhoods, broke into houses, and destroyed entire families. Chronicles wrote about burned neighborhoods, where only blackened skeletons of houses remained in the morning. The Black Nights of Paris were especially terrifying, when a wrong word or accent could cost you your life. In 1418, when the Burgundians entered Paris, everything took on a new scale. The lists of Armagnacs became death sentences, people were dragged from their homes, and the streets became a place of mass executions. For the first time, Paris felt that civil war was not a battle on the field, but a massacre within its own walls. Be honest, can a state survive if it cuts itself to pieces? And what did the king do? Charles VI sat in the Louvre, wrapped in pillows, afraid of cracking from his own body. France was burning, and its ruler lived in a delusion where he was not a king, but a fragile glass statue. The power vacuum was filled by others. And then a woman who was supposed to be the king's support and a symbol of stability came on the scene. But her move was another blow to France. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, a woman who will be remembered by history as a traitor. While Paris was drowning in blood, one person in the royal court tried to maintain control. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. She was supposed to be the guardian of the crown and a support for her husband, whose mind had long since disappeared into his own delusions. But history remembers her quite differently. Even during Charles VI's lifetime, rumors spread around Isabeau about lovers, conspiracies, and even incest. For her contemporaries, she became a symbol of corruption and later, of betrayal. The worst happened in 1420. Isabeau turned away from her own son, the Dauphin, the legitimate heir to the throne, and formed an alliance with the enemy. The Treaty of Troyes effectively transferred France to English control. King Henry V of England was proclaimed heir to the French throne after the death of Charles VI. Think about it. The documents stated that the country had both a living monarch and a successor who was already ruling in his place. For the French, this was not just humiliation. It looked like the death of the crown itself. The Queen of France officially renounced her own son and handed over the crown to a foreign ruler. For the people, this was not politics, it was betrayal. The highest betrayal possible. In the imagination of the French, Isabeau became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. If Charles VI had lost his mind, she had lost her honor. Together, they destroyed the foundation of the state. It seemed that France was doomed. The English celebrated their victory. Paris was divided, villages were burning, and there was no future. But it was during this dark time that a figure who seemed incredible intervened in the fate of France. Not a duke, not a king, not a cunning queen, but a 17-year-old peasant girl, with the voices of saints in her head and a flag in her hands. France lay in ruins. King Charles VI was a living corpse, afraid of touch and forgetting his own name. Queen Isabeau was a traitor who handed the crown over to the enemies. The capital was torn between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. The English were already marching triumphantly across French lands. It seemed that the country was doomed. And that's when she appeared. Joan, a 17-year-old peasant girl from Domremy. No titles, no money, no army, only unshakable faith. She claimed to hear the voice of the Archangel Michael, who commanded her to lead France to victory. At first, she was treated as a joke. But Joan convinced the commanders to give her a chance. And that chance changed everything. How would you react if, during a war, a girl with no experience came to you and said, "I will save the country"? In 1429, she made history when, under her leadership, French troops lifted the siege of Orleans. It was impossible, and yet it happened. To her contemporaries, the victory seemed like a miracle, a direct response from heaven to the chaos. Most importantly, Joan accompanied the Dauphin, the son of Charles VI, to Reims, where he was crowned Charles VII. At that moment, France once again had a king recognized by the people. The contrast was striking. While her father was afraid to crack like crystal, a 17-year-old girl walked under arrows with a flag in her hands. This image became a metaphor for the era, a king who was falling apart, and a simple peasant girl who held the country together with the power of faith. But even to the sound of fanfare in Reims, the shadow had not yet disappeared. For Charles VI was alive. His madness and weakness still hung over France like a ghost. And when 1422 came, this long tragedy came to an end. Charles VI died as he had lived for the last few decades, almost unnoticed. In 1422, his heart stopped in Paris, but for most French people, nothing changed. The country had long since learned to live without its king. It was autumn outside. Chroniclers wrote that there was no mourning in the city, rather, relief. This is perhaps the most terrible verdict, a monarch whose death brought no loss, because his absence was felt even during his lifetime. His body was buried with the usual honors, but without real respect. For how can one mourn a ruler who spent most of his life in fear and delusions, who did not recognize his wife, rejected his children, and signed documents with a cross, like an illiterate peasant? Legally, after Troyes in 1420, the English crown was to become the heir. But thanks to the coronation of the Dauphin in Reims, 1429, and the change in the balance of power, Charles VII established himself as King of France. But the legacy of the Glass King was disastrous. The country, which was still a superpower under his father Charles V, fell apart under his rule like a broken glass. Civil war, English occupation, ruined cities, thousands of dead. Charles was afraid of cracking, but in the end, he did not break himself. He broke France. The story of Charles VI is a reminder. When power becomes as fragile as glass, it is not only the crown that cracks, but the state itself. Do we not see similar cracks today?